Dann würde ich jetzt einfach mal 2, 3 ganz kurze Worte zum Abschluss sprechen, bevor ich dann übergebe, damit ihr nach Jeff Jarvis nicht alle schnell weg seid. Ganz am Ende wird unser Vorsitzender Frank Überall noch 2, 3 Worte an euch richten. Wer mag, kann oder sollte. Es wäre schön, wenn ihr alle dranbleiben würdet. So. Okay, also ich danke euch für diesen wunderbaren Tag mit vielen Pannen. Ich glaube, ich habe noch nie so viel Nervennahrung gebraucht und habe ungefähr gefühlt 1000 graue Haare mehr, aber es hat auch ganz viel gemenschelt und ich finde, wir haben gezeigt, das, was ich heute Morgen gesagt habe, wir haben das Netz wirklich heute zu einem bisschen besseren Ort gemacht, zumindest was die Konferenz angeht. Und ich danke euch, dass ihr nicht zu viel gemeckert habt über eventuell nicht funktionierende Technik. So, ich hoffe, wir sehen uns und bleibt gesund, vernetzt euch und das war's von mir tatsächlich und es gäbe wohl kaum einen besseren Abschluss als den fantastischen Jeff Jarvis. Vor ein paar Wochen durfte ich ein Interview mit ihm machen, der ein oder andere hat es vielleicht gelesen und ich war wirklich selten so beeindruckt von einem Gespräch. Das sage ich jetzt auch nicht nur so, weil es jetzt gerade der Zeitpunkt ist, sondern es war wirklich so. Und er glaubt fest daran, dass aus dem niedergebrannten Haus des Journalismus, das durch Corona einfach komplett nochmal explodiert ist, auch was Neues, Gutes wachsen kann. Und das habe ich ja heute Morgen auch schon so ein bisschen signalisiert, dass das eben mein Glaube ist. Und wir müssen bereit sein, zuzuhören, um uns zu verändern und so auch neue Formen des Journalismus zu schaffen und mehr Gemeinschaft. Und jetzt sage ich einfach, thanks for being here with us, Jeff, and the go-to-meeting stage is yours.
Ja, willkommen zu dem Talk mit Jeff Jarvis. Das Thema auf Englisch, das Ute eben beschrieben hat, ist Journalism Reborn from the Ashes. Jeff sagte mir gestern, dass er nicht so auf Monologe steht, deswegen versuchen wir, eure Fragen, eure Kommentare mit einzubinden. Maurizio Gemmer, mein Kollege, wird den Chat im Blick behalten und mir dann Rückmeldung geben, was von euch so für Fragen und Anregungen kommen. Jeff ist auch bereit, mit euch direkt zu sprechen. Da müsste der jeweilige Kommentator die Kamera und das Mikrofon kurz einschalten und kann dann die Weltöffentlichkeit und Jeff Jarvis erreichen. Ansonsten ist es besser, wenn ihr die Kamera und Mikrofone ausschaltet, sonst gibt es speziell bei den Mikrofonen möglicherweise Störgeräusche. And now, since his German is not that fluent, I will move to English to talk to Jeff. Short introduction, although it's not really necessary. He's an American journalist working as a professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. He's a public speaker and former television critic. He blogs about media topics, buzzmachine.com. Very interesting reads. I can recommend it. And he hosts the podcast This Week in Google. Among other things, he is convinced that public life on the internet has many social and personal advantages. Maybe we can talk about this later. I'm personally grateful to him because he once created my favorite print magazine of all time, Entertainment Weekly, although he only stayed for a short while. I'm glad you could make it, Jeff. How are you and how's New York City?
Wonderful, and thank you for having me. Es tut mir leid, dass mein Deutsch so schlecht ist. Seit Schule gibt es zu viele Jahre und habe ich zu viel vergessen. And I'm too old to learn. So I'm delighted to be here, Peter, and Ute, thank you very much for that interview. I enjoyed speaking with you. And as you said, one thing I said when we spoke was that I think that our media house was already on fire and Corona threw gunpowder on the flames. And what we're seeing is various media houses, I think, exploding. But I believe that we'll come back from the ashes, sprouts rising from the ashes. And I just don't know what form that will take. I want to mention that at my school, the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, we have just redone our journalism program, where we're now going to concentrate on that program on the individual resilient journalist, on the individual lone wolf journalist who may make newsletters and blogs and Medium posts and YouTube videos and TikTok even, and that they'll earn money from, yes, subscriptions, but more likely Patreon and Kickstarter and newsletters and events when we can do that again, and book contracts and whatever. I think we're going to see, I hope we're going to see a flourishing of independent innovation in journalism, but I don't know. It's risky, it's hard, it's expensive. In the US right now, All of our major newspaper companies are controlled by either hedge funds or by families who are exhausted and none of them are likely to invest in innovation. I think we're going to see innovation come at a very small level. The only thing I want to mention before we get started is that I think that we also have to reconsider the definitions of journalism, given the lessons that we have in this age. Having gone through almost 4 years now of Donald Trump, and I apologize to you all for what my nation has done to the world, we have to ask ourselves whether journalism is up to the task of reporting in these times. I celebrate the fact that now everyone has a press. The internet is built for speaking, and I think that is wonderful because there are voices who were not heard in mass media who are finally being heard because they have their own microphones. I understand you had a panel about diversity earlier in the conference, and that's extremely important here in the United States, where we're clearly having great problems with that. So I celebrate all the voices the internet brings, but I think the internet is not built for listening yet. I think there are huge opportunities to rethink what we can build around the idea of listening, and we can start with journalism and understanding better how to listen. I think that we have a lesson to learn from the scientists in COVID. Early on in the epidemic, I saw that our problem wasn't so much disinformation, misinformation, trolls, and Russian bots. Our problem was ignorance about science and medicine, and the solution to that is expertise. So I decided it was my job as a journalist to amplify the voices of experts, and I created a Twitter list of COVID experts at bit.ly/COVID Twitter list. I'll say it again, bit.ly/COVID Twitter list, with 600 epidemiologists, virologists, infectious disease doctors, and experts of all sorts. And I've learned watching how they adapted to an open information ecosystem where they use preprint servers to share their papers as quickly as possible. They use Twitter to create peer review on that. They also use social media to explain these things to the public. It's very impressive how scientists and doctors adapted to this open information ecosystem much faster than we did. So when we come back from the flames of COVID and we see what builds up next, I hope we do so with innovation in mind and an openness to listening to the public, to new voices, and also to others who've used the internet very well, like scientists. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Jeff, I found it interesting that you said that the internet was not built for listening, but wasn't that the purpose of the internet, to give a voice to people who haven't been listened to before?
Yes, but the problem is that the internet was built for speech, and everyone can now speak, but we don't have the mechanisms to find out what's worth listening to. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. You even look at Jack Dorsey has talked about making Twitter an open platform, where the value he would add would be on top of that, of finding who's worth listening to, who's relevant to you, who's expert, who has authority. Those are the things that our old institutions of media used to do. We need to reinvent them in new ways. So yes, I celebrate the speech, but you can't have a conversation unless you have both speech and listening.
I mean, if we have billions of speakers but no listeners, I mean, how can journalists find their audience?
I would use a different word. My friend Jerry Rosen at New York University calls the public the people formerly known as the audience, because audience is a passive word of people who just take in what we give them, right? I have started a new program at Newmark called Social Journalism, which is all about finding communities that we serve. And I see journalism as a service, not as a factory making a product called content. And so if we think about journalism as a service, we're not trying to find the largest audience possible. That's the old mass media business model, which is dead. I think what we have to do instead is find communities that need service and listen to them, understand their needs, and then bring them the journalism that they need.
I found it interesting that you said that at your school you're concentrating on the lone journalist. Do you think that journalists have to think more in an entrepreneurial way?
Yes, but let me also be clear that we changed this program. We've had the program going for about 10 years, and it was concentrated at first on the idea of the journalist starting the company. So trying to get a little bit of investment and hire people and so on. That's too difficult, we learned. So this is more about the individual who can start a Medium site and a Substack newsletter and a podcast and obviously Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok accounts, and Patreon means of getting contributions from the public, and events, and so on. And so I think we're going to find more people who find a fairly small niche community to serve and use those tools to do that. That's not true of all journalists. Our journalists still get hired at major publications, but we're seeing obviously all of them, especially in the US, shrinking.
I think Patreon may not be that popular in Germany yet. It's a service where people can pay journalists and other creators small amounts of money for their work. Do you know of cases of journalists who actually make their living with services like that?
Absolutely. There's one who covers technology. Ben Thompson has a blog called Stratechery with a premium newsletter that he has out. One of my graduates, when Trump got elected, started a daily newsletter called What the Fuck Just Happened Today? And it was a list because our minds were being blown by everything that Trump was doing. It was a compilation every day of the horrors of Trump. He earns over $100,000 a year from that.
Are those a few shining examples, or do you really think there's a future for freelance journalists for that?
It's a few shining examples, and I've been wrong before. I thought when I wrote a book called Geeks Bearing Gifts that the hyperlocal blog would be a building block for a new local ecosystem of news. I was wrong. I was wrong for a fair number of reasons. One was that journalists don't much like business, aren't very good at it, and don't like the risk of it. And there are not enough who are willing to come and make the risk of starting a new venture like that. And so I don't want to go too far in predicting that this will work. There are isolated examples, many of them, of hyperlocal blogs that work, but it was never going to be enough to cover a city and cover the country. These independent journalists, we have our first class starting in our new program in October, and we have a lot of applicants, but only when they go out in the world and we see whether they feast or starve will we know whether we've succeeded.
You said that journalists often don't like business, but people who do like business are the business people, the publishers and the owners of media corporations. Where do you see their futures? I mean, they're complaining a lot.
Yes, but I think they have to recognize that, and they have recognized that the realities of our business has changed. What I think the internet did was kill the mass media business model, and we're still trying to keep it alive. And I talk about this often, that the problem is, of course, we know that when you move from a scarcity-based economy and business, which was ours. I own the printing press, you don't. I have pricing control, you don't. We moved from there to an abundance-based market, where, of course, what happens is prices go down as supply goes up, and then when prices go down, desperation goes up, and we end up in a world now where we have, on the one hand, in the free internet, we have clickbait, cats and Kardashians. And then we have a growing premium internet where I sadly think that one of the problems we're going to have in society is that journalism and news are going to be restricted for the privileged who can afford it and are willing to pay for it. And I don't think that's going to help society in the long run. So we've got to rethink our models, and I'm not sure exactly how that works. But what I've been advising publishers is to move from thinking about one product for all and to start to build the skill of serving multiple communities in deeper ways. So we build a deeper relationship with people. We have multiple opportunities for revenue, not just subscription, but also membership, contribution, commerce. I convinced one American newspaper company to start selling things, and they very quickly had a $2 million line of revenue, gross revenue. You look at the Minden Tageblatt, which is delivering beer and shoes and office supplies for their local stores and readers. Not going to become rich that way, but it's a way to think about service. Also, events, and education, perhaps. I think these are all the kind of revenue streams that we can explore when we move past mass to serving people in greater depth at smaller scale. But the smaller scales add up. Sorry.
Before we return to journalism, one more question about revenue streams. There has been an interesting phenomenon during the Corona crisis that there probably has never been a higher need for good quality journalism, but at the same time, ad revenues decline. Where do you see a way out of this dilemma?
I think we did a bad job of educating the advertisers going long back because we don't want to argue with the person who has the money. And the very unfortunate trend I see happening is that advertisers, even before coronavirus, were running away from controversy and news. And too often, especially in programmatic advertising, they were starting to cut off any support of news for fear of being extra controversy. And the fact that they did that in Corona is really ridiculous, because here's something people are living with every day of their lives, and the advertisers weren't there with them. You find some brands who are there and are doing this. Now, of course, comes the pandemic, and as is obvious, most in the United States still, because we are so messed up, restaurants are closed, in-person retail is dying, huge stores and malls are going bankrupt and dying. Those advertisers are disappearing. So there isn't much to do about that. But I believe in advertising. I believe if we did not have the support of advertising, journalism would die. We have to help the advertisers reinvent their business. I believe around helping them build deeper relationships with the public. Now, the problem is they may not need us. I went to a dinner with some advertisers in New York about a year ago when we still could do that. And when they had enough good Cabernet, they admitted that they didn't need us. They are building direct relationships with their own customers. And the only time they needed us, they said, was for their stock price. So I said, the only thing you need is the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. And they said, yes. That's frightening. But that's the way they're thinking. They're thinking about building direct relationships with people more than we are.
We have the first questions coming in from the audience. One question is, do you see journalism as the fourth pillar in the democracy?
Yes, I do, and I'm trying to work on a book right now. I don't have a publisher yet. I'm still working on it, but it's about the Gutenberg Gauge. And so I've been doing research about this, and I think that, yes, journalism is the fourth pillar, but I read an essay recently that argued that now the public is the fifth pillar. That the public now having their own microphones, having their own presses, that's what's changed. What's different fundamentally now is the obvious statement that everyone has their Gutenberg press. Everyone has the opportunity, as we said earlier, to speak. And we don't have the systems to grapple with that and understand that. And some people are scared about that. There's a moral panic that goes on that says we have too much information, too much speech. I hate hearing that, because if you say there's too much speech, who decides what's too much? The speech is going to be out there. We've got to understand better systems about how we listen to people and understand what their needs are, understand how they operate. And I think we have to look at the public as its own institution.
Since you talk about speaking out, this leads to the second question. Could you explain where you see the difference between those lone wolf journalists you're talking about and influencers?
Influencers have their voice bought by brands. And it's just like the problem of sponsored content, native content, infomercials in media. When I started the magazine Entertainment Weekly, thank you for the plug, some executive walked into my office one day with a big book and plopped it on my desk and said, "Yeah, there's the rules about how you print advertising in a magazine." But he said, "I can summarize it all, Jarvis, in one sentence. The reader must never be confused about the source of content." What we have done too often now with native and sponsored and so on is we in media have confused the public about the source, who's paying for something. influencers are just that. They are walking, talking native content, and brands tried to buy their voice, and thus they lost their credibility. So I think that the influencer wave is going to be very short-lived.
Do you think that there's a chance for journalists who have such hard-hitting content that they have a chance to become influencers in the social media?
I think they have the chance to become influential. I think they have the chance to build their own relationships, but they should not sell their name and their voice to a brand. That's not to say that a brand can't support their work, but again, we have to have a clear line. The old line of church and state was the advertising floor and the editorial floor. Now we're split as journalists. Here's church, here's state, right? We have to make these decisions about how to maintain our credibility at an individual level. I've had this discussion with my students where when I came up through the field, and I'm old enough now that the world was very different. I started with hot type. If you left the newsroom and went to work in public relations, we sat Shiva for you. You were dead to us, right? You would never come back. You were no longer a journalist. Well, that's not the case anymore. Now, young people on Monday will write for a newspaper, and on Tuesday will write for Nike, and on Wednesday will write for their own blog, and on Thursday will write for McDonald's. And they do that to earn a living. They do that to get money to be able to feed the journalism they do. I don't begrudge them that, but it's a very hard thing to keep in your head about how to remember whom you're serving.
Another question deals with a new outlet or a relatively new outlet that's gaining in popularity a lot, the podcast. What do you think of podcasting as not only a tool of broadcasting, but also a tool that helps listening?
I love podcasts. I'm on one every week called This Week in Google. If you go to twit.tv/twig, it's there. It's part of a network of the This Week in Tech network, which is run by Leo Laporte. He has about 15 podcasts. Before Corona, he's very open about this. He was earning about $9 million a year in revenue. It's a good business. It has a strong relationship with people. The only issues I see are these. One, we're soon going to be overdosed in podcasts. It's going to be very hard to stand out and to find enough of an audience. And two, yes, they are a mechanism of listening to a point. It's still about, here's my podcast microphone, right? It's still about doing what you and I are doing right now, which is talking to the world. And how do we make podcasts more interactive where you can hear the voices of the public?
Since you brought up the G word, in 2009 you wrote the book What Would Google Do? And you said that businesses should listen more to methods used by Google to move ahead. Are there any aspects today in 2020, 11 years after your book, that people should pick up from Google? How would Google react?
Yeah, I think still is the case, and I think most of what I said in the book was fairly obvious about Google and how you work in the internet age, how you experiment in public, you risk failure, you learn from your users as quickly as possible, you recognize the value of abundance and openness. I think all that's still true. When I wrote the book, I did say this. I said that the wars that had not yet been won were for mobile, social, and local. And I think that's still true. I could never have predicted how Google would become a phone company. This is my Android phone. I live La Vida Google. And I think that no one has yet conquered how to understand how to do local. And on social, Facebook is obviously the winner as of now, but nobody is the winner forever. And I think that Facebook and Twitter, again, Facebook is a platform built for speaking with people you know. It's not a platform for understanding how to find people you'd like to know very well. It has its problems. And so I think that Nonetheless, there are still lessons to be learned from Google, even from Facebook and from Twitter. I had this thought the other day. As you know, the Australians have a law pending, which is pushed by Rupert Murdoch, to force the media companies and the platforms to negotiate with each other with a gun to the platform's head to pay for content. And Facebook has said that if this law passes, they will take news off of Facebook. Google has threatened to take Google News out of Australia. And part of my problem with this is I think that we in media left a lot of opportunity to the side. That is to say that when Facebook started, it wasn't about news at all. It was about, getting dates and parties. But users brought news to it. Why? Because they couldn't discuss news the same way on our platforms. Twitter started as a way to say, hi, I'm in the bar now. Users brought news to it because they didn't have the way to share what they were witnessing on our news platforms. Google added news search because news was hard to find. TikTok brought a kind of collaboration that doesn't exist in our platforms. We lost all of these things as opportunities because we stuck too much to trying to do what we always did and trying to protect that.
We talked about social media before. Quite a few of my peers among journalists are reluctant to use social media. They don't want to present what they consider their private life on Facebook and Twitter and the like, which is why I mentioned the line from your Wikipedia entry. I'm quoting again, you are convinced that the public life on the internet has many social and personal advantages. What are the advantages for journalists from your point of view?
I think many. I think a primary revelation from the recent times of the United States about race is that we in mass media did not listen to enough communities. We did not represent them in our newsrooms. We did not represent them in our pages. And it was only because of Twitter and Facebook and social media and the hashtag that we could get hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Me Too, hashtag Occupy Wall Street. And I get angry with journalists who in the US say that they're going to leave social media because they're just fed up with it. But when they do that, they turn their backs on the voices who are finally heard, who were not heard before in mass media. I have this issue at my school where we have white professors, old white men like me, who look at a journalist, a young journalist from a community that's not mine, and they try to present us with stories, and some of my colleagues, just like editors, say, oh, that's not big enough. Not enough people care about that. That was the problem with old mass media. And what social media did was enable communities who were too long ignored to be heard. And if we ignore them, that's at our peril because we end up not serving the public. You don't have to tell the world what you had for breakfast. That's okay. But you should use social media to listen. And again, I found in starting my COVID Twitter list that I was able to listen to the doctors and the scientists who were in the front lines of emergency rooms and laboratories in ways that I couldn't in media. And I learned how we have to cover early research. I also have made it my job lately to try to amplify voices not heard, which includes African American and Latino voices in the United States. I can do that through social media.
You just mentioned your list. In the interview with Ute, you said that today the problem is not disinformation, but ignorance. And of course, the best antidote against ignorance is expertise. And you're trying to document 600 people with expertise in your list. But will this list reach people who are ignorant? I mean, this list will probably only be used by people who have a general interest already.
Twitter is promoting the list. There are now 16,000 followers of the list, which is not a huge number, but it's more than I ever thought. My only hope for the list was that journalists would follow it. Quick story. There was a controversial paper about serum antibodies from Santa Clara, California, that argued it was an argument that was being used that the shutdowns were not a proper response. This was early on. It was a very controversial paper. It was on a preprint. It was not peer reviewed. Within hours of that paper coming up, 12 epidemiologists and virologists who I have been following, who I respect, peer reviewed that paper in detail on Twitter. Now then, a few days later, the New York Times wrote about the paper and did the one thing you shouldn't do. When you have a controversial paper, you never stop at quoting just the author of the paper. They should have gone on Twitter. They should have seen these other doctors who were there, who had valid arguments and points to make that the New York Times should have raised. It was an irresponsible story. Now, the San Jose Mercury News, on the other hand, did go to Twitter, did find these doctors, and did show that there was controversy around this paper, which was far better journalism. So in using the tools of social media, the journalists can do a better job of finding more sources rather than the same old list they always use. And by the way, that means getting more scientists who are women and people of color. The New York Times did a story early in the pandemic about the heroes of COVID. Every one of them was a white man. And women scientists have had a proper fit about this and wrote a wonderful letter to the Times education supplement saying that by excluding women and people of color, you exclude other viewpoints that matter.
Talking about white men, in the interview with Ute, you said that one of today's problems is the fear of old white men of losing power. I mean, I wouldn't call you old, but how did you become fearless in this regard?
Oh, I'm not fearless. I have just different fears. No, I realized this, that I think what I believe we're seeing in the United States is that we have the old white uneducated men, some of them uneducated, some of them educated, who are the Trumpists. It's racism. It's fear of an unknown future. It's fear of the immigrant. It's fear of the black person. It's fear of the Latino person who's the immigrant coming across the border. It's fear of women. It's fear of losing power and losing privilege. And so what they're doing is just they have a scorched earth strategy. They're burning down every institution in this country. They're burning down Congress and the courts and education and departments in the government. They're trying to burn down everything rather than share it. And so the paradox here is that the people we used to call conservative, who would conserve and preserve old institutions, are now the ones destroying those institutions rather than sharing them. That's the old white men. And the people who are liberal, who want to be progressive and build new things, are the ones trying to preserve those institutions. And it's a real paradox as to where we are in this country right now. And I'm sorry that we have spread the likes of QAnon now to Germany. And I believe that we need new strategies as journalists about how to deal with this. I think we're operating on very old assumptions about mankind, about how the brain operates. And I think we have to bring in other academic disciplines to reinvent and redesign journalism. I want to hear from cognitive scientists and psychologists and psychiatrists and anthropologists to better understand how these communities form and what we can do about them.
Reinvent journalism. I want to add a quick question about how journalism can reach the existing audience. How do you think that, you mentioned all the negative developments in the United States? I'm sometimes afraid that the Trumpists, or in Germany AfD voters, are lost to traditional media. How do you want to reach racist, sexist, and otherwise bigoted people?
I think some people are lost to us. I remember early on in the shutdown, I saw a TV report from a woman who was driving to church when we knew this was causing super spreader events, and she said that she would be fine because she had the blood of Jesus on her. I don't think one article is going to do much to convince her otherwise. Some people are lost to us, but I think there's a vast number of people who are not. This is why I separated the era of disinformation after Trump with the era of ignorance now. And we're all ignorant about scientists. The scientists are ignorant about how COVID is operating. We are learning as we go. We have to respect the science. And I firmly believe that there are parents and children who want to know as much as they can about this disease to protect their loved ones. Now, so we've got to try to serve those people first, those who care and want to know. If we try to deal with the fringes, we won't serve that vast middle. And some of the fringes are just simply lost to us. You listen to people who have no logic left in their brains. The only solution to this, in the end, is education. Look at the numbers on Trump. The basis of his base, as we call it in American media, is uneducated white men. Uneducated is the key word there. White matters because it's racist. Men matters because it's misogynist. It's the old power structure. But uneducated matters as well because it is education that brings us a liberal view, small l liberal, of an enlightened view of the value of information and the value of knowledge and the value of expertise. What's happening now is that there is just an anti-intellectual war going on from that quarter of the country.
Ganz kurz noch was Organisatorisches, das habe ich bisher übersehen. Die Bitte an alle, die noch Mikrofone angeschaltet haben, bitte ausschalten, weil es offenbar Störgeräusche gibt. Merci. Jeff, when we talked before this interview, I mentioned Nicole Diekmann to you, ZDF journalist who has been subject to bad shitstorms on Twitter. And an audience question deals with her. Jeff, do you agree to the statement of Nicole Diekmann earlier this day that mass media still don't have social media strategy, for instance, to protect their journalists from attacks and shitstorms? Are there lacking strategies?
Yes, and I think they head the wrong way. So you look at the new Director General of the BBC just made a statement to his staff within the last week saying that there are going to be new rules on social media and they're going to strictly punish their journalists for showing themselves as human beings on social media. I think that is exactly the wrong way to go. I think instead what we have to do is empower the journalists to be able to speak and listen and to ignore and to cut off and block people and not to make the mistake of feeding the trolls. Are we going to be able to? The problem with this idea of being able to shut down things is that it's a false goal. We will never shut down disinformation. We've always had disinformation. In fact, the difference now is it's easier to see it. We will never shut down trolls and assholes in the world. They will always be there. But the effort should be to pay less attention to them.
The next question deals with social media as well. Does journalism education or general further education have to change in order to meet the challenges of social media?
Yes, I think so. And this is why I started a new degree program in social journalism at the Newmark School. Let me explain briefly what that program does. We tell the journalists to start with the community, not with content. And by the way, this isn't just about Twitter and Facebook. This is about a different relationship of the journalist to the public. So we tell them to find a community that is self-defined, not bullshit like millennials, but a community that has a self-definition of shared need, shared interest, shared circumstance. Then we tell them to go and observe and listen to that community, almost like an anthropologist, to come to a better understanding of empathy and understanding, and then to reflect their understanding back to that community to make sure they have it right. And then they can start to decide what journalism they can bring. Now, this is not the same as trying to do 25 blog posts a day to get more page views. It's expensive, it's different, but our social journalists are getting hired because they are bringing to newsrooms the ability to understand how to truly serve communities in different ways. Now, along the way, yes, they learn about Twitter, they learn about Facebook, they learn about data, they learn about engagement, they learn about how to convert people into be subscribers and contributors. They learn all of that, but in the end, what they really learn is how to serve a public.
Talking about serving communities, where do you see the role of publicly funded TV and radio stations like PBS in the States or ARD, ZDF in Germany?
It's a great question, because I think that public media can be truly public in a stronger way. And I've had this argument in Germany where the publishers stopped ZDF and ARD from doing too much online, which I think was actually a mistake. I think that the public media should be the laboratory for private media. I think public media should have an ethic that says that the things they gather are gathered at public expense and should be available to private media. That's one. Two is, I think they should have an ethic of saying that the audience they have, they should share with private media by pointing to the best of journalism. Third, I think that they should share the expense of technology with private media so that they can help with what is a very troubling and expensive part of what we do. And fourth, I think that they should share innovation, and this one is the least realistic of my arguments, because I know that public media operate with public funds, and they get a little scared of failing, but they should be the place that has license to experiment, to try new things, and then to share that learning with private media, to take the risk, because they are not at risk. They have public funds. I think that there's a major role. Now, that's speaking of places where public media already exists. In Germany, in Britain, in France, and other countries. In the United States, it's entirely different. I am completely opposed to government support for media and journalism here, partly because we have a First Amendment, but partly because we have a Donald Trump. And I shudder to think what would happen if Donald Trump had control over the survival of any outlet of media in the United States. Now, whenever I've had this argument in the past, friends of mine in the UK have said, but the BBC, but the BBC. And I always say, but two words, Donald Trump. And they still said, but the BBC. And now I say, but two words, Boris Johnson. So he is bringing a pressure on the BBC that I think could be very damaging. And so I'm always cautious about government support of speech and media, but that's my American prejudice.
The rapid fire list that you gave me in the start of your reply gave me the impression that you thought about this before. So here's another easy question. Where do you see the main differences between the US and German media scene?
A lot. And I'm very conscious of being American and having my own Weltanschauung as a result. I think a key difference is that since mid last century, Germany has had a robust collection of national media brands from different perspectives. We did not have that in the United States. Once television came along, it killed the second and third newspapers in cities. So if you lived in Cleveland, Ohio, you had one newspaper. If you live in other cities, you had one or maybe two newspapers. And so we had local monopolies built, which were very good businesses. A mid-30s market in the year 2000 was earning in job classifieds alone $40 million, which of course disappeared. And so they were incredible monopoly and oligopoly businesses. Whereas in Germany, by having a national competition among Der Spiegel, the Süddeutsche, FAZ, Die Zeit, Die Welt then, and ARD and ZDF and so on, created a more competitive landscape, which I think was a lot healthier. That's one difference. Another difference is that there is a different culture in Germany around reading and authority. When I went to the Frankfurt Book Fair, I was amazed at the last day or two of the Messe, the public can come in, and it was just jammed with the public as big fans of books. I'm sorry to say that wouldn't happen in the United States. So I think there is a different relationship to the culture that Gutenberg began in the book, and I think that's important. From what I understand, the local media market is almost as troubled as it is in the U.S. One more point to make is that I have talked to German media companies I'm scared for because their proportion of digital revenue is very low. I've talked to companies that have single-digit percentages of digital revenue. That's potentially suicidal. I have been arguing to media companies for 20 years now that they have to pick a date in the future where print will become unsustainable, and by that date, they had better be able to see themselves as a fully sustainable digital enterprise, a digital company. And if you're not profitable digitally by that date when print becomes unsustainable, your company is unsustainable and you'll die.
Okay, since we're back to the business, I'll return to the original motto of this talk, journalism reborn from the ashes. As you said before, you're pretty optimistic about media business. You call Corona not a threat, but an opportunity. Where do you see journalism and the media business after the smoke has risen? Maybe next year, year after next?
I don't know. I'm not a predictor. I think that the most bullshit job title on earth is futurist. I think that we will see an odd mess of little experiments. I think we'll see little podcasts and newsletters and social companies and other things that pop up here and there. What we lose in that is the coverage of a whole country, the coverage of a whole city, a whole community. But I think what we'll gain is a lot of experimentation. In the US, I think we're going to see the folding of print newspapers has long been predicted, but I think we're going to see it happening. I look at the Independent in London, where my friend John Payton is now the chairman. When they had to close down their print operation, John says they are now profitable online. Hallelujah. I think there's an opportunity to prove the view. Now, meanwhile, Die Zeit has its subscriptions at record highs, right? It's still going up, but Die Zeit is a special animal, I think, and I love that it exists, and I love that it's successful. But just as in the U.S., everyone tries to look at the New York Times and say, well, look how many subscriptions they have. I can do that too. No, you can't, because you're not the New York Times. There's only one New York Times. There's only one Die Zeit. There's only one Der Spiegel. And Süddeutsche and FAZ. You have more in Germany. But here in the U.S., the mid-range Gannett paper cannot succeed against in the same strategy as the New York Times.
Kurzer Hinweis, wir liegen in den letzten Zügen. Wer noch eine Frage unterbringen will oder einen Kommentar, hat noch knapp 10 Minuten Zeit. Back to Jeff. Before the talk, I mentioned to you that we had a great diversity panel at Besser Online with Sham Jaff and Tembi Wolf. What's the situation like in the United States? Are the media still ruled by the aforementioned white old man, or has the situation changed?
No, it's a big problem. We have been trying in the United States for generations now to increase diversity in newsrooms, and we have failed. The Association of Newspapers in the U.S. cannot even get its members to report the numbers of reporters, journalists, and managers, people of color, because they're too ashamed of the low numbers and the failure here. My school is a city university, and we are more than half journalists of color, more than half women. We're very proud of that. But we also find out that we're sending these journalists out into newsrooms where they are not understood, where their stories are thought to be too small, where we've just done a recent study. We just put out what we call the Leavers study, where we looked at 100 people journalists of color who left journalism because they were fed up. We are losing talent more than we are gaining it in the field. I also think that there was a recent study that came out that looked at the history of journalism and slavery in the United States, and by Jordan Taylor. And I found out, to my shock and horror, that newspaper proprietors were part of the slave trade. They were agents for slave traders. So we owe reparations as a field in this issue. We haven't come to grapple with it. Now, I say all that saying that I had a meeting at my school yesterday to say we are also grappling with this at my school. I need training. I need people to help me understand better what I don't understand. That's my job. It's not the job of the Black or Latino journalist to teach me, but I do need help in learning better how to do this so that I can do a better job of teaching my students how to cope with this world.
Oh, there's a great new question which touches on a pet subject of mine. Is there a limit for the First Amendment? It's interesting because in Germany, the practices are a little bit different from the United States, at least before 9/11.
I believe strongly in freedom of expression and freedom of speech. There are limits, right? The famous you can't yell fire in a theater. We have laws on defamation and libel. So there are limits, but I want as few limits as possible. I get very worried about an atmosphere of moral panic in which those in power think that they should try to shut down the speech of others. And I reread a speech by John Milton after he had visited Galileo for having a speech that was shut down. And he wrote the Areopagitica, urging the King and Privy Council in the United Kingdom not to license speech and license printing presses and license books, because then a small number would decide what was legitimate speech. I worry about Netzdege in the same way, that the government of Germany has deputized a private company to decide what is manifestly illegal without due process, without courts. And so what the private company is going to do is obviously be too cautious and take down too much speech. I think that's dangerous. What Milton argued is that if we think we can clean up bad thought, then we're also not educating the public in how to do that themselves.
Well, shortly before the end, we are getting all the heavy subjects.
Good.
There's a big discussion in Germany about activism versus journalism and opinion versus attitude. When we start listening to so-called minorities, we are accused of trying to make politics instead of amplifying voices. How could we solve this dilemma? How, for example, when reporting on Black Lives Matter or women's rights?
It's an excellent question. It's one that we grapple with my students every single week. I'm not afraid of questioning that line between activism and advocacy and journalism. We have always been advocates. We have always been advocates for justice and advocates for the little guy against the man and advocates for truth and transparency. So I have no problem with the idea that we are advocates and even activists in those areas. But what separates us is our intellectual honesty, reporting the things that do not comport with our wished worldview. What separates us is our standards of accuracy and fairness and completeness and currency. What separates us then is that effort at reliability. One of the big arguments in the US these days is about objectivity as a word. And there was a wonderful essay in the New York Times by Wesley Lowery, a journalist who had been at the Washington Post, who said that objectivity is itself in a white-run industry, it is a racist concept, because it is the old white men who look like me who decide what objectivity is, and that journalists of color don't get the opportunity to be part of that discussion. They are just told what they did was unobjective. I interviewed, and you can find this on YouTube, a transgender man named Louis Raven Wallace, who was fired from public radio for not agreeing to this view of objectivity, and wrote a book called The View from Somewhere, which is very good, about the need for us to recognize the value of people's lived experiences. So I think this comes down to what is now becoming an overused word, transparency. We have to be open about our own perspective, our own lived experiences, and we have to do a better job of understanding others. So yes, we cover Black Lives Matter and women's rights, And yes, we should be wary of the presumptions that come in our speech. So when we say things in media in the US like racially tinged rather than racist, or we say it was a police-involved shooting rather than using the active sentence, the police shot so-and-so, or the police killed George Floyd. Those are choices that we made in an effort to be objective or journalistic or distant that failed. And so I think we have to just do a better job of explaining the thinking that goes into what we do.
Okay, final question. Are there any media outlets or any ways of presenting journalistic content that really excited you lately? Best case practice, so to speak?
Yeah, they may not. They're odd ones in the sense that I quite like the company I love to talk about is called Spaceship Media. Because I have tenure at my university, I can do obnoxious things like redefine journalism. And my definition of journalism now is to convene communities into respectful, informed, and productive conversation. I'll say that again, to convene communities into respectful, informed, and productive conversation. And that is what Spaceship Media does. It brings together communities that might be in conflict. For example, women who voted for Trump versus women who voted for Clinton, African-American high school students and their teachers, people who are for guns and against guns, and so on. And they have a methodology to bring them together. And let me just mention how they do it. A journalist interviews the people and gets to know them a little bit and starts a relationship. Then they throw them into a private Facebook group. And the first day, things are fine. They talk about their lives. The second day, things are hell because they start getting into fights. But then magic occurs. They go to the journalist and say, can you help us out? Can you look up some stuff for us? And that is to say that they want an informed conversation. They value facts and they trust the journalist to get them for them. The heavens open and the angels sing, because that's how journalism should operate. And so what Spaceship delivers back to the community is not stories and narratives. They deliver them what they call fact stacks, series of facts, the things that they asked for, the things that they were confused about or wrong about or needed to know or were debating to inform their conversation. So that's a view of journalism that was informed by the conversation and that in turn tried to inform the conversation. I quite like that one. Another one is in Chicago called City Bureau, where they train people, citizens, to go do things like cover school board meetings, and they pay them for it to make the journalism more collaborative. Texas Tribune, I think, is doing a wonderful job in Texas, and two of their managers left to start a new organization called the 19th, which is a not-for-profit news organization covering especially politics and public policy from the perspective of women, because they're too often not covered. These are just a few examples of things that I liked and respect.
For selfish reasons, I have to throw in a question about the future of journalism conferences. Where do you see conferences going in terms of Corona? Will I see you in Perugia next year?
I dream so. I want my cacio e pepe. I want my good red wine. I want to sit on the plaza and argue with you. I think we still have to come together. Yes. Not being in Perugia, not being with you in person, not being at Scoop Camp next week bothers me greatly. I used to travel about 300,000 miles a year, and now it's zero. And I think we lose a lot as a people, especially Americans, who are so isolated in the way we think, by not hearing about things in other countries, by not hearing other examples. So I think we'll still come back together. I'm not sure it's going to be in 2021. It depends on how much America and fucks up the world with coronavirus and how quickly Joe Biden can unfuck us. If he wins, knock on wood. And so I think we're going to be in this for quite a while to come. But I think there's a couple of newspaper companies, the Tribune company is closing a lot of newsrooms. And I worry about that, as everyone does. But I also see some benefit in that. Right? We were always told as reporters to get out of the newsroom and get in the community. And salespeople, get out of your office and get in with the customers. And I think there may be an advantage to learn out of Corona how we get out more, and not just physically in our communities, because we can't, but also to use the tools of social media and the internet to find people we didn't interview before, to interview them on television from their home, which is a great advancement. I think that we can turn some of these lessons we've gotten in the coronavirus into big advantages. So what I hope too about conferences is, yes, we still get together in person, but we come together more frequently from more corners of the world online.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeff. It has been wonderful to talk to you. The next Cacio e Pepe is on me. And if you like what you heard as well, follow Jeff on Twitter, read buzzmachine.com, and wait for his book on Gutenberg. And maybe after this talk, more people will not ask what would Google do, but what would Jeff do? Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. A real pleasure.
Thank you.
Wir kommen jetzt zum letzten Highlight von Besser Online. Frank Überall, der Bundesvorsitzende des Deutschen Journalisten-Verbandes DJV, ist im Lande und möchte mit uns sprechen.
Ja, im virtuellen Lande, in der Tat bin ich. Und ich freue mich auch schon darauf, wenn wir irgendwann wieder einen Kaffee oder einen Rotwein zusammen trinken können und diskutieren können, so wie Jeff Jarvis es gerade gesagt hat. Ich freue mich aber auch, dass diese Konferenz das erste Mal komplett virtuell tatsächlich funktioniert hat. Dazu auch den Organisatorinnen und Organisatoren einen ganz herzlichen Glückwunsch vom DJV-Bundesverband. Wir hatten ja alle ein bisschen gezittert, ob das wirklich funktioniert. Ich habe gehört, hin und wieder gab es auch mal kleine Holpereien bei der Technik. Dafür bitten wir um Verzeihung. Aber insgesamt, glaube ich, hat diese Konferenz sehr gut funktioniert. Und ich glaube, gerade in diesen Zeiten ist es wichtig, sich darauf zu konzentrieren, sich bewusst zu machen, welche Rolle spielt eigentlich Journalismus in diesen Zeiten. In diesen Zeiten, die immer digitaler werden. Besser Online, die Tagung gibt es ja jetzt schon seit ein paar Jahren. Und ganz zu Beginn war das irgendwo noch so was Exotisches, dieses Neuland, um da eine Vokabel mal aufzugreifen. Und mittlerweile ist Journalismus natürlich komplett angekommen im Digitalen. Für viele Menschen auch eigentlich nur noch präsent im Digitalen. Und was mich freut bei dieser Tagung, auch bei den Panels, die es heute hat, dass es eben hier nicht nur ums Lamentieren geht, dass es nicht nur darum geht, sich zu ärgern, dass die Printauflagen zurückgehen, dass Journalismus auch vielleicht nicht mehr dieses Lagerfeuer entfacht, wie das früher einmal der Fall war, dem nicht einfach hinterher trauern, sondern nach Chancen zu suchen. Gemeinsam zu überlegen, was sind die besten die besten Wege in dieser digitalen Welt? Wie können wir sie beschreiten? Welche Chancen gibt es? Welche Herausforderungen? Wie können wir Journalismus an der Stelle noch besser machen, noch digitaler machen? Wir haben da ganz viele spannende Eindrücke bekommen, auch Einblicke von Praktikerinnen und Praktikern bekommen. Dafür auch allen Referentinnen und Referenten vielen Dank, allen, die mitdiskutiert haben. Ja, wie Jeff Jarvis es gerade gesagt hat, wir brauchen für eine gesellschaftliche Kommunikation, für einen gesellschaftlichen Diskurs, gerade auch in einer Demokratie, zunächst erstmal Information. Und da brauchen wir uns Journalistinnen und Journalisten, einen Berufsstand, der Informationen recherchiert, aufbereitet, einordnet. Und ich bin fest davon überzeugt, dass das auch dauerhaft nicht nur notwendig ist, sondern auch dauerhaft von der Bevölkerung anerkannt wird. Auch wenn wir natürlich noch über Monetarisierungsstrategien immer wieder diskutieren müssen, danach suchen müssen. Aber ich bin fest davon überzeugt, dass viele, die nicht laut rumschreien im Netz oder auf der Straße, sondern eher sich ruhig in der Öffentlichkeit geben, dass der ganz großen Mehrheit der Bevölkerung bewusst ist, was Journalismus für sie leistet. Und auf diesem Weg wollen wir weitermachen. Auch als DJV diskutieren wir bei dieser Tagung, aber auch in vielen anderen Formaten darüber, wie sich Journalismus entwickelt und ja, auch wie sich Arbeitsbedingungen entwickeln für freie Journalistinnen und Journalisten, aber auch für Festangestellte. Wenn wir gehört haben, es ist wichtig, dann eben auch sich mit Communities auseinanderzusetzen, dort mit zu diskutieren, nicht nur zu recherchieren, sondern eben nicht nur zu senden, sondern auch zu empfangen. Da muss man sich bewusst machen, dass das eine Tätigkeit ist, die natürlich von den anderen Tätigkeitsfeldern irgendwo zeitlich auch abgeht. Man kann nicht immer noch eine Schippe oben drauflegen. Und das müssen dann eben auch Medienorganisationen, Medienunternehmen erkennen, dass das eine valide, eine notwendige, eine gute Arbeit ist, die dann auch entsprechend gut bezahlt werden muss. Da gibt es noch viel zu kämpfen, da gibt es noch viel Einsatz zu erbringen und da stehen wir als Deutscher Journalisten-Verband, als DJV an der Seite der Kolleginnen und Kollegen. Und noch einmal, ich bin froh, dass es Besser Online gibt. Ich bin froh, dass es hier viele spannende Panels gab und auch hoffentlich im nächsten Jahr geben wird, die uns einen Einblick geben, was alles funktionieren kann und wie wir Journalismus in der digitalen Welt dauerhaft nicht nur lebensfähig machen, sondern einfach richtig spannend machen. In diesem Sinne ganz herzlichen Dank nochmal an das Orga-Team. Danke an alle, die so lange dran geblieben sind. Und jetzt müssen wir unseren Kaffee oder unseren Rotwein leider alleine trinken. Und ich hoffe sehr darauf, dass es irgendwann wieder Besser Online dann auch als Präsenztagung gibt, wo wir das dann wieder alles gemeinsam tun können. Herzlichen Dank und ein schönes Wochenende noch.
Vielen Dank, lieber Frank. Dir hat die Technik jetzt leider auch ein kleines Schnippchen geschlagen. Du warst nicht mehr zu sehen, zumindest warst du nicht mehr im Bild, aber zu hören warst du gut. Vielen Dank und ich sage einfach nochmal Tschüss, kommt alle gut nach Hause, kann ich mir ja sparen. Wahrscheinlich seid ihr einfach alle zu Hause oder vielleicht auch irgendwo im Garten oder im Urlaub. Ja, bis zum nächsten Jahr, ob online oder in echt, können wir jetzt noch nicht sagen. Es war schön mit euch. Tschüss.
Tschüss.